The universe was full of noise, but most of it meant nothing, and most of it was old light from dead stars that nobody cared about anymore, and signals bouncing between relay stations carrying trade reports and political arguments, and all the boring things that kept a galaxy of 10,000 species running like a machine that had forgotten why it was built in the first place. But this signal was different. Deep inside the Vayathi Nebula, where dying stars painted the dust clouds in shades of red and gold, a ship called the Gentle Inquiry was screaming for help, and the scream was real and raw, and it cut through the background noise of the galaxy like a blade through silk. The Gentle Inquiry was a Larathi research vessel, and it was never built for war, because the Larathi had never fought one, and they had never needed to, because they were a gentle species with skin that glowed soft blue and violet when they were happy, and deep red when they were angry. Were afraid. And right now, every single one of the 4,000 Larathi aboard that ship was glowing the darkest red their bodies could produce. Senior Communications Officer Yanala pressed her bleeding hands against the console and forced herself to stay conscious, even though the pain was like fire running through her bones, and the ship groaned around her like a dying animal, and the lights flickered, and somewhere below her deck she could hear the sound of metal being torn apart from the outside. The Vraxith had found them. Everyone in the galaxy knew what the Vraxith were, and everyone in the galaxy pretended they were someone else's problem, because that was easier than doing something about it. The Vraxith were a swarm species that moved through space like locusts through a wheat field, and they did not negotiate, and they did not communicate, and they did not stop, and they ate everything and everyone in their path, and converted the biomass into fuel for their endless hunger. 7 Vraxith harvesters had surrounded the Gentle Inquiry, and they were cutting through the hull with plasma torches that burned hotter than the surface of a star. And Yanala could hear the screams of her people echoing through the corridors. And mixed in with those screams were the high, thin wails of children, because this ship carried 200 younglings on an educational voyage, and those children were now huddled in the central biodome with their teachers, trying to keep them calm, while monsters ate through the walls. Yanala activated the emergency broadcast, and she put everything she had into that signal, and she broadcast it wide and open on every frequency she could reach. And she did not encrypt it, because she wanted everyone to hear it, and she did not care who was listening, because anyone would do, and someone had to come, and someone had to care. The signal raced outward at the speed of light, and then faster through the subspace relay network, and it reached Concordance Central Command in less than 4 minutes. Admiral Geltur of the Kasvari Hegemony was the ranking military officer on duty, and he was a tall, insectoid creature with compound eyes that could process 12 visual streams simultaneously. He watched the distress signal play out on his command screen with all 12 of those eyes. He saw the damage reports, he saw the life sign readings, and he heard the children crying in the background. Then he checked the tactical database and confirmed the attackers were Vraxith. He already knew what his orders would be before he gave them. Strategic withdrawal advisory for the entire sector, and all ships were to avoid the Vayathi Nebula until the Vraxith moved on. No rescue fleet would be dispatched, and the Gentle Inquiry and its 4,000 souls were officially classified as within acceptable loss parameters. The Larathi ambassador stood before the Concordance Council 3 hours later, old and frail, and her skin flickered between grief red and the pale white of despair. And she begged them, and she pleaded with them, and she told them about the children, and she asked them how they could hear that signal and do nothing. And every single delegate in that enormous chamber looked at their hands, or their screens, or anywhere except at her face. And the answer she received was silence dressed up in diplomatic language that meant the same thing it always meant, which was that her people were not worth the cost. But the signal did not stop at the Concordance. 300 light-years from the nebula, A human corvette called the UEN Outrider was running a long-range patrol along the border of mapped space, and Captain Rena Vasquez was drinking coffee in her command chair when the signal hit her communications array, and her comm officer played it on the bridge speakers, and the bridge went quiet. Vasquez was a small woman with dark eyes and scars on her hands from a dozen deployments, and she had been a soldier for 20 years, and she had heard distress calls before, but she had never heard anything like this. And what made her set down her coffee and sit up straight was not the damage reports or the tactical data, but the sound underneath all of it, which was the sound of children screaming. And she knew that sound, because she had a daughter back on Earth, who was 6 years old. She opened a priority channel to United Earth Naval Command, and within 90 minutes, her report had reached Fleet Admiral Koji Tanaka, who was a quiet man with gray hair and steady hands, who had commanded human fleets for 30 years and had never lost a battle, and who read the report twice, and then looked at the ceiling of his office for a long time. Then he picked up his comm and authorized the deployment of Battle Group Prometheus, 26 warships, led by the dreadnought UEN Thermopylae, which was 2 kilometers long and carried enough firepower to crack up Moon, and the order went out across human space, and ships began to move, and reactors powered up, and crews ran to their stations, and the fleet converged on the Vayathi Nebula, like wolves answering a howl in the night. Across a dozen concordance relay stations, the operators on duty watched their screens with growing disbelief as they tracked the energy signatures of the human fleet. And the readings were so high that automated hazard warnings began firing on every monitoring system in the sector. And one by one, the operators contacted their superiors, and their superiors contacted their governments, and the word spread through the halls of galactic power like a cold wind. On the Concordance Council floor, a Kasfari diplomat leaned toward his colleague and whispered in a voice that shook slightly, and what he said was this: "The Deathworlders are moving, and they are bringing everything they have." And for the first time in a very long time, the galaxy paid attention to the humans, and the galaxy was afraid. The wolves arrive. The gentle inquiry was dying, and everyone aboard her knew it. The Vraxith drones had breached the outer hull on 3 decks, and they moved through the corridors like nightmares made of black chitin and bladed limbs. And they did not speak, and they did not pause, and they consumed everything organic they found. And the Lorathi crew had no weapons because they had never needed weapons, because no one had ever tried to eat them before. Yinala had been moved to the central biodome with the other survivors, and she lay on a makeshift stretcher while the ship's medics tried to stop the bleeding from the wounds in her side. And around her, the biodome was packed with terrified civilians, and the younglings were clustered in the center, surrounded by their teachers, who sang soft songs to keep them calm, even though the teachers were just as frightened as the children. The barricades they had built from cargo containers and furniture would not hold for long, and everyone knew that too. And some of the older Lorathi had tried to reach out to the Vraxith with their empathic abilities, hoping to find some flicker of intelligence or mercy or anything that could be reasoned with. But all they found was hunger, and it was a hunger so vast and so empty that it made them recoil in horror, because there was nothing behind it and nothing inside it, and it just wanted to feed. The ship shuddered as another section of hull was peeled away, and through the biodome's transparent ceiling, Yinala could see the dark shapes of the Vraxith harvesters hanging in space above them like predators circling wounded prey. And she closed her eyes and thought that this was how her people would end. And no one was coming, and no one had ever come, and no one ever would. And then space tore open. Battle Group Prometheus dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a formation so precise and so perfectly timed that every ship arrived within a half-second of every other ship, and the Concordance military analysts who reviewed the sensor data later would use the word terrifying 11 times in their official report, and the word beautiful once. 26 human warships materialized around the Vraxith harvesters like a fist closing around an insect. And at the center of the formation was the UEN Thermopylae, and it was enormous, and it was dark, and it bristled with weapon systems that the Concordance had never seen before, because humans did not share their military technology with anyone. The fleet broadcast on all frequencies, and the message was simple, and it was delivered in a calm, clear voice that carried no emotion at all. This is the United Earth Navy addressing unidentified hostile vessels in the vicinity of the Larathi research vessel, Gentle Inquiry. And you will cease all hostile action and withdraw immediately, or you will be removed. The Vraxith did not respond, because the Vraxith never responded, because the Vraxith did not understand language or negotiation or mercy, and they simply continued cutting into the Larathi ship, because that was all they knew how to do. Captain Vasquez's outrider had arrived hours before the fleet, and had been hiding in the nebula dust, feeding targeting data to Prometheus as it approached. And the moment the fleet arrived, Vasquez transmitted the final firing solutions, and Fleet Admiral Tanaka gave a single order: weapons free. What happened next took 11 minutes, and the Concordance would study those 11 minutes for decades, trying to understand how a species that had only been in space for a few centuries could fight with such brutal efficiency. The human ships did not fire wildly or spray the area with energy, hoping to hit something the way most Concordance species fought, and instead every shot was placed with surgical precision, and the first volley disabled the Vraxith harvesters' propulsion systems, so they could not flee, and the second volley destroyed their weapons arrays, so they could not fight back, and the third volley killed them. 7 Vraxith harvesters that had terrorized this region of space for years were reduced to expanding clouds of debris in less time than it took most species to finish a meal. And the battle was not close, and it was not a contest, and it was not even a fight, and it was an execution carried out by professionals who had come a very long way to do a very specific job. But the killing was not over, because the Gentle Inquiry had already been breached, and Vraxith drones were inside the ship, moving toward the biodome, where 4,000 Larathi waited to die. Fleet Admiral Tanaka dispatched Marine Assault Company Helldivers, and 200 human soldiers in powered combat armor launched from the assault carrier UEN Fury of Sol, and crossed the distance between ships in armored boarding pods that slammed into the Larathi vessel's hull, and burned through in seconds, through the corridors of the Gentle Inquiry, like a force of nature. And they were each over 2 meters tall in their armor, and they weighed 4 times what a Larathi weighed, and they carried weapons that could punch through starship bulkheads, and they used those weapons with terrible purpose. The Vraxith drones were fast, and they were savage, and their bladed limbs could cut through most metals, but they had never encountered anything like human marines in full combat gear. And the drones came apart under concentrated fire, and the marines did not slow down, and they did not hesitate, and they cleared the ship deck by deck with a methodical violence that left no survivors among the enemy. Yanala heard them before she saw them, and what she heard was the heavy rhythmic thudding of armored boots on metal floors, and the sharp crack of human weapons. And then the barricade at the biodome entrance was pulled aside, and the largest living creature Yanala had ever seen stepped through. Gap. The marine was enormous, and the armor was scarred and dented, and there was Vraxith blood on the faceplate. And for one terrible moment, every Larathi in the biodome flinched, because this thing looked like a predator, and it moved like a predator, and everything about it screamed danger. Then the marine saw the younglings. The soldier stopped, and the weapon came down, and for a moment the giant just stood there, looking at the cluster of small glowing children, who stared up with wide, terrified eyes. And then the marine did something that no Larathi expected. The soldier knelt, one knee on the deck, and the massive armored frame folding down until the faceplate was at the level of the children's faces. And then the helmet retracted, and underneath was a human face. And it was a young face, with brown skin and dark eyes, and a scar across the chin. And the human was smiling, but the smile was sad and gentle, and the Marine spoke in Larathi that was broken and clumsy, clearly rehearsed during the journey here. Safe now, and we are here. One of the younglings reached out with a tiny glowing hand and touched the Marine's scarred face, and the child's skin shifted from deep red to the softest shade of blue, which meant that for the first time in hours, the child was not afraid anymore. Around the biodome, other Marines were taking up positions and securing the entrances and calling for medical teams, and their voices were loud and rough and foreign, but they moved around the Larathi civilians with extraordinary care, and when they needed to step over or around the smaller aliens, they did so with the kind of deliberate gentleness that only the truly strong can manage. The Concordance intelligence services intercepted the after-action footage within hours, and it spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and billions of beings on thousands of worlds watched the human fleet dismantle the Vraxith with cold precision, and then watched those same humans kneel in the dirt and carry wounded aliens in their arms, and position their greatest warship as a shield over a crippled research vessel that was not even theirs. On the Concordance Council floor, no one spoke for a very long time, because they had spent decades telling themselves that humans were dangerous animals, barely fit for civilized space, and they had been right about the dangerous part, but they had been completely wrong about what that danger meant, and now they did not know what to say. And in the biodome of the Gentle Inquiry, Yanala lay on her stretcher and watched the young Marine sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by Larathi younglings who had climbed into the soldier's lap and were falling asleep against the hard armor plates. And the Marine did not move, because moving would wake them. And Yanala thought that she had never understood humans before this moment, and she was not sure she understood them now. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had come, and no one else had. The galaxy holds its breath. The galaxy had not stopped talking about the humans for 3 weeks, and it showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. On every world, and every station, and every ship that had access to the Galactic Communication Network, the footage played on repeat. And there were 2 clips that people watched more than any others. And the first was the moment Battlegroup Prometheus dropped out of faster-than-light travel, in that perfect, terrifying formation. And the second was the moment the Marine knelt before the Larathi children. And those 2 clips together told a story that made the entire galaxy deeply uncomfortable. Because it was a story about a species that could destroy you in 11 minutes, and then cry over your children. And nobody knew what to do with that information. The Larathi ambassador stood before the full Concordance Council on the 18th day after the rescue. And she was an old woman named Ithara, and her skin glowed with the pale, steady light of someone who had moved past grief into something harder and colder and more permanent. She spoke for 40 minutes, and she did not raise her voice once, and she did not need to, because every word landed like a hammer. She told them about the 4,000 souls aboard the Gentle Inquiry, and she told them about the 200 younglings, and she told them about the signal that had gone out on every frequency begging for help, and she told them about the response that came back from the Concordance, which was silence and strategic withdrawal and acceptable loss parameters. And then she told them about the humans. She told them how a species that the Council had spent decades calling monsters and animals and Deathworlders had crossed 300 light-years in a matter of hours to save people they had never met. And she told them how those supposed monsters had carried wounded Larathi in their arms and sung clumsy lullabies to frighten children. told them how the most dangerous species in the galaxy had proven itself to be the only species with the courage to do what was right. And then she said the thing that broke the council. You heard our children screaming, and you did nothing. And the humans heard our children screaming, and they sent a fleet. And I want every delegate in this chamber to sit with that truth and tell me which species is the real monster in this story. The chamber was silent, and it stayed silent for a long time. The Lorathi government formally requested a mutual defense pact with United Earth, and this was the first time in the history of the Concordance that any member species had sought a direct bilateral alliance with the humans, and it sent shockwaves through every government in known space. The Concordance fractured almost immediately along two lines. The first faction was led by Admiral Geltor and the Kasvari hegemony, and they were afraid, and their fear made them angry. And they stood before the council and called the human intervention a calculated power play and an act of military expansionism disguised as charity. And they demanded sanctions against humanity and restrictions on human fleet movements. And they said that allowing humans to form alliances would destabilize the balance of power that had kept the galaxy safe for centuries. The second faction did not have a leader, and it did not have a name, and it was made up of the small species and the wake species and the species that had spent their entire existence being preyed upon by groups like the Vraxith. And these species did not speak on the council floor because they did not have enough votes to matter. But they sent quiet messages through back channels to human diplomats. And those messages all said the same thing, which was, "We saw what you did and we will remember." On Earth, the rescue was celebrated in the streets, and Rena Vasquez became a household name overnight. Of the Marine with the Lorathi children was projected on buildings in every major city. But not everyone was celebrating. Fleet Admiral Tanaka stood before a UN Com review board, and the admirals and politicians on that board did not question whether the rescue was morally right, because they all agreed that it was, and instead they questioned the scale of the response, and they asked Tanaka whether deploying an entire battle group for 4,000 aliens was a sustainable military doctrine, and they asked him what would happen when the next distress call came, and the one after that, and the one after that. Tanaka listened to all of their questions, and then he said 7 words that would be carved into the wall of the Naval Academy a year later. You do not get to run the numbers when children are screaming. The review board moved on to other matters. But the galaxy was not done with humanity, and humanity was not done with the galaxy, because 3 days after the review board, a classified intelligence report landed on Tanaka's desk, and what it contained made the old admiral sit very still for a very long time. The 7 Vraxith harvesters destroyed at Vayathi had been a scouting element, and nothing more, and the main body of the Vraxith swarm was 312 vessels strong, and it was moving through deep space on a direct course for Lorathis Prime. And the attack on the Gentle Inquiry had not been random, and it had not been an accident, and it had been a probe sent to test the defenses of the Lorathi people. And the Vraxith had found exactly what they expected to find, which was nothing. The Lorathi homeworld was home to 11 billion souls, and it had no military, and no orbital defenses, and no weapons of any kind, and the Vraxith swarm would arrive in approximately 6 weeks, and when it did, it would strip the planet bare and consume every living thing on it, and an entire civilization would cease to exist. Report to the Concordance and asked for a joint defense operation, and the Concordance looked at the numbers and calculated the cost and said no, because the strategic justification was insufficient, and the risk was too high, and Lorathis Prime was too far from the core worlds to matter. The Lorathi were going to die, and the galaxy had decided that this was acceptable. Tanaka flew back to Earth, and he stood before the United Earth Parliament, and he was tired, and he looked tired, and he told them everything, and he told them about the swarm, and he told them about 11 billion Lorathi, and he told them about the Concordance's refusal to act, and then he made his request, Operation Iron Veil, which was the full deployment of Earth's naval reserves to defend an alien homeworld, and it would be the largest military operation in human history, and it would cost money and ships and lives, and there was a real chance that it would fail. The Parliament debated for 6 hours, and the debate was fierce and honest, and some representatives argued that humanity could not save everyone, and some argued that humanity could not afford to be the galaxy's protector, and some argued that the risk was simply too great. And then a junior representative from a small district stood up, and she was young, and she was nobody important, and she said that she had watched the footage of the Marine holding the Larathi children, and she said that her grandmother had told her stories about a time on Earth when people looked away from suffering because it was not their problem. And she said that her grandmother had a word for people like that. She did not say the word because she did not need to. The vote passed unanimously. Across human space, reserve fleets began to power up, and shipyards that had been quiet for years roared back to life. And soldiers who had retired years ago put their uniforms back on, and freighters were converted into supply ships and hospital vessels. And the entire machinery of human civilization turned toward a single purpose, which was the defense of a world that was not their own, filled with people who were not their people. On Larathis Prime, in a hospital, overlooking the crystal forest that her species had tended for 10,000 years, Yinala was recovering from her wounds, and a human doctor had been assigned to her care. And the doctor was kind and patient, and had learned to dim the lights, because Larathi eyes were sensitive. Yinala asked the doctor if the rumors were true, and the doctor said that they were, and Yinala asked why the humans were doing this, and the doctor thought for a moment, and then said that it was complicated, but also very simple. And then Yinala looked up through the hospital window, at the night sky, and she saw new lights moving among the stars, and the lights were human ships, arriving one by one, and two by two, and then in great formations that crossed the sky like rivers of fire. The first time since the attack on the Gentle Inquiry, the color of her skin shifted from red to blue. Iron Veil. Larathis Prime was a world that had never known war, and now war was coming to it, and the humans were determined to make sure it survived. 140 warships arrived over the course of 3 weeks, and they filled the orbital space above the planet like a wall of metal and fire. And with them came troop transports and engineering vessels and supply ships and medical frigates. And the sheer scale of the human deployment stunned the Larathi, who had never seen so many ships in one place, and had certainly never seen ships that looked like these, because human warships were not elegant, and they were not beautiful, and they were built for one purpose, and that purpose was obvious. Fleet Admiral Tanaka established his command aboard the Thermopylae in high orbit, and from there he directed the construction of the most ambitious defensive network ever built by human hands. And his engineers worked around the clock, building orbital gun platforms and seeding vast minefields in the approaches to the planet, and constructing shield generators on the surface to protect the major population centers. And they did all of this in 3 weeks, because the swarm was coming, and time was a luxury they did not have. The Larathi watched the humans work, and they did not understand most of what they saw, but they helped where they could, and their scientists worked alongside human engineers to calibrate the shield generators, and the two species discovered something surprising, which was that they liked each other, and the humans were loud and strange, and they ate food that smelled terrible, and they laughed at things that were not funny, but they were also warm and curious, and they asked the Larathi about their crystal forests and their bioluminescent oceans, and they listened with genuine wonder. On the 7th day of preparation, something unexpected happened. A small Dralkani frigate wing dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the planet. system, and the Drelkani were a reptilian species with 6 legs and armored hides, and they were not powerful, but they were proud, and their government had officially sided with the Kasvari in opposing the human intervention. But this wing had come anyway, against orders. The wing commander was asked why, and he said that his people had watched the humans run toward the fire, while everyone else ran away. And he said that he had been ashamed of himself and his species. And he said that he had come to stand beside the humans, even if his government would not. 2 days later, a Mosari medical ship arrived, and after that, a Paivathi scout squadron, and then a handful of civilian vessels, from species so small that most of the galaxy did not even know their names. And they came with whatever they had, which was not much, but they came. Tanaka welcomed every single one of them. On the 23rd day, the long-range sensors detected the Vraxith swarm, and what the sensors showed made even the most experienced human officers go quiet. 312 vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Larathis system, and they were enormous, bioorganic warships covered in black chitin that absorbed light and made them look like holes cut in the stars. And the swarm moved as a single mass, a writhing constellation of hunger and death, and it was the largest Vraxith force ever recorded, and it had never been defeated, and every species that had tried to fight it had been consumed. The swarm outnumbered the human fleet more than 2 to 1. On the surface of Larathis Prime, 11 billion Larathi looked up at the sky and waited, and in the hospitals and shelters, their skin glowed deep red with fear, but among the red there were flickers of blue, because the humans were here, and the humans had promised, and the Larathi had learned in the past weeks that when humans made a promise, they kept it. Fleet Admiral Tanaka stood on the bridge of the Thermopylae, and he looked at the sensor readings, and he looked at his officers, and then he addressed the entire fleet on an open channel. All hands, this is Tanaka, and what is coming toward us has destroyed everything it has ever touched, and it has never been stopped. And today we stop it. And I will not lie to you and tell you this will be easy, because it will not be easy, and some of us will not go home. But behind us is a world full of people who cannot fight for themselves, and we are the only thing standing between them and extinction, and that is all you need to know. The swarm advanced, and the battle began. The first phase was the anvil, and the Vraxith charged straight at the human defensive line, because that was all they knew how to do. And they hit the minefield first, and 40 vessels were torn apart in the opening minutes, as the mines detonated in cascading chains that turned space into a wall of fire, and the orbital gun platforms opened up next. Concentrated fire into the swarm as it pushed through the wreckage. But the Vraxith learned fast, and they began using their own dead ships as shields, pushing the burning hulks ahead of them and absorbing the fire. And the swarm kept coming, because it always kept coming, because hunger doesn't stop, and hunger doesn't think, and hunger just moves forward. Then Tanaka sprung his trap. Battlegroup Nemesis had been hidden in the nebula dust on the far side of the system, and it had been silent for days, running on minimal power, invisible to sensors, and at Tanaka's signal, 32 warships hit the swarm's flank at full speed, and for the first time in recorded history, the Vraxith were caught between 2 forces. The fighting became savage. Human ships moved through the swarm, trading fire, at ranges so close that the ships were almost touching, and the Vraxith drones launched in clouds from their carrier vessels, and swarmed over human warships, trying to cut through the hulls, and the point defense systems on the human ships fired continuously, creating a storm of light around every vessel. The destroyer UEN Resolve took a critical hit to its reactor core, and its captain knew the ship was dying. And he also knew that the Vraxith dreadnought in front of him was breaking through toward the planet. And he made a decision that took less than a second, and the Resolve accelerated to full speed and rammed the dreadnought head-on. And both ships vanished, in an explosion that was visible from the surface of Lorathis Prime. All hands lost. The battle raged for 19 hours without pause, and the Vraxith attempted to break through to the planet's surface, launching landing craft that screamed through the atmosphere toward the population centers. And the human Marines made orbital drops directly into the path of those landing craft, falling through the sky in their powered armor, and fighting on the hulls of enemy ships in freefall, in vacuum, in conditions that would have killed any other species in seconds. On the ground, human soldiers formed defensive lines around Lorathi cities. And the Lorathi civilians could not fight, but they could do something else, because their empathic abilities allowed them to sense the Vraxith approaching from kilometers away, and they relayed positions and movements to human commanders in real time. For the first time, humans and Lorathi fought together, not as two species, but as one force. The partnership changed everything because the humans provided the strength and the weapons and the willingness to die, and the Lorathi provided the eyes and the awareness and the knowledge of their own world. Together they were something that neither could have been alone. The battle turned, and the Vraxith began to lose ships faster than they could replace them. And the swarm's advance slowed, and then it stopped. And then for the first time in the long and bloody history of the Vraxith swarm, something happened that had never happened before. The swarm retreated. The surviving vessels broke formation and scattered into deep space, fleeing in every direction. And the human fleet pursued for 2 hours, destroying stragglers before Tanaka called them back, because the planet was safe, and that was all that mattered. The skies above Lorathis Prime burned with the wreckage of hundreds of ships, and debris fell through the atmosphere in streaks of fire that lit up the night like falling stars, and the crystal forests reflected the light in 1,000 colors, and on the surface the Lorathi emerged from their shelters and looked up, and the battle was over. In the ruins of a defensive position outside the capital city, a human Marine sergeant sat on a pile of rubble, and he was battered and bleeding, and his armor was cracked in 6 places, and he was so tired that he could barely lift his head. A Lorathi elder walked through the smoke toward him, and the elder was ancient, frail, and her skin glowed with a light that pulsed in slow waves of deep blue, and she reached out and placed both of her hands on the Marine's face. Through the empathic link, the Marine felt what the elder felt, and it hit him like a wave, and it was gratitude so vast and so deep that no language in the galaxy had a word for it. And it was love for a stranger who had bled for people he did not know. And it was the raw, overwhelming relief of a species that had been seconds from extinction and had been saved. The Marine closed his eyes, and tears ran down his face, and he did not wipe them away, because there was no shame in them. Around them, in the ash and the light, Lorathi and humans stood together, and they were alive, and the planet was safe, and the stars were coming out one by one above them, like promises being kept. New stars. 6 months after the Battle of Lorathis Prime, the galaxy was not the same place it had been before, and it would never be the same place again. The concordance was crumbling, and everyone knew it, and the only question was what would replace it, and whether the thing that came next would be better or worse than the thing that had failed so completely when it mattered most. 12 species had formally withdrawn from the Concordance's mutual defense framework, and they had done so publicly and loudly, and the statement they released called it a mutual indifference pact, and that phrase spread across the galaxy and became the thing that everyone called it, and it stuck because it was true, and everyone knew it was true, and the Concordance could not argue against it, because the evidence was a battle that had been fought by humans and volunteers, while the Concordance watched from a safe distance and counted acceptable losses. And Admiral Geltour, who had ordered the strategic withdrawal that had nearly allowed the Lorathi to be wiped out, found himself facing questions from his own people, and the questions were not polite. And the Kasvari citizens had watched the same footage as everyone else, and they had seen human soldiers dying for aliens they had never met, and they had seen their own government refuse to lift a single claw, and they were angry in a way that the hegemony had never experienced before. On Larathis Prime, the crystal forests were growing back in the places where the battle had scorched the earth, and the Larathi had a word for this kind of regrowth, which roughly translated to the light that comes after fire, and they used this word a great deal in the months that followed. Humanity and the Larathi signed the Larathis Accord on the 120th day after the battle, and the ceremony was held in the capital city in a plaza that overlooked the place where the Marine Sergeant and the Larathi elder had shared that empathic moment in the ashes, and the plaza had been rebuilt and renamed, and it was called the Plaza of First Light. The accord was a mutual defense and cultural exchange treaty, and it was simple and clear, and it said that each species would defend the other as if defending itself, and that knowledge and art and science would flow freely between them, and it was the foundation stone of something larger. Because other species came. The Drelkani signed on within 2 weeks, and then the Masari, and then the Paivathi, and then a dozen smaller civilizations that had spent their entire histories being afraid and being ignored, and being told that their safety was someone else's problem. And these species came together, and they formed something new, and they called it the Compact of Sheltered Worlds. The founding document of the Compact was written by 2 people working together, and one was a Larathi poet named Valith, who had survived attack on the Gentle Inquiry, and the other was a human marine corporal named James Okafor, who had been one of the soldiers on the ground at Larathis Prime. And they wrote the document together over the course of a week, arguing about every word until they had something they both believed in. The founding principle read as follows: No signal for help shall go unanswered, and no voice crying in the dark shall be met with silence. And the strong shall stand for the weak, not because it is easy, but because it is what strength is for. The victory had not been free, and no one pretended that it was. Humanity lost 14 warships and 6,200 personnel at the Battle of Larathis Prime, and every single one of those losses was felt, because humans grieved their dead fiercely and personally, and they did not forget, and they did not move on quickly, and they did not treat their fallen as acceptable losses. A memorial was built in the capital city of Larathis Prime, and it was constructed jointly by Larathi crystal shapers and human stonemasons, and it was a spire of living crystal, woven through with granite, and the crystal pulsed with soft blue light, and the granite was engraved with names, and 6,200 names is a great many names, and the spire stood 40 meters tall to hold them all. Fleet Admiral Koji Tanaka visited the memorial every week when he was on the planet, and he stood before it in silence and read the names, and he knew most of them because he had been their commander, and he had sent them into battle, and some of them had not come back, and that weight would be with him for the rest of his life, and he accepted that weight, because it was the price of the decision he had made, and he would make the same decision again. The crew of the UEN Resolve were honored with the highest decorations both species could bestow, and the Larathi created a new honor specifically for them, called the Shield of Larathis. Never existed before, because the Larathi had never had anyone to give such a thing to. Yinala became the first Larathi ambassador to Earth. She traveled there aboard a human diplomatic vessel, and the journey took 3 days, and when the ship arrived in the Sol system, she stood at the observation window and looked at the small blue world that had produced the species that had saved her people. And it looked so ordinary and so fragile from this distance, and she could not understand how something so small had produced something so fierce. When she stepped onto the surface of Earth for the first time, the gravity hit her like a wall, and the air was thick and heavy, and the wind roared, and the sun was blinding, and her legs trembled with the effort of standing upright. And she understood immediately that this was a world that was trying to kill everything on it, all the time. She was taken on a tour of the planet's surface, and she saw oceans that churned with storms, mountains that pierced the sky, and deserts that burned, and forests that were so dense and wild that they seemed to swallow the light. And she saw earthquakes, and she saw footage of hurricanes and volcanic eruptions, and she thought about the Lorathi homeworld with its gentle breezes and soft light, and crystal forests that had never threatened anyone. On her third day on Earth, she stood in a park in a human city and watched human children playing outside during a thunderstorm. And the sky cracked with lightning, and the rain came down in sheets, and the thunder shook the ground, and the children laughed and ran through the puddles and shouted at the sky as if daring it to do its worst. Yinala watched them, and something clicked into place in her mind, like a puzzle piece she had been turning over for months. Of course they came for us, she thought. They have always lived in the storm, and they were born into a world that tried to kill them every day. And they survived, thrived, and they laughed in the face of it. And when they heard our children screaming, they did not calculate the cost, and they did not measure the risk, and they simply came, because leaving someone to drown in a storm was something they could not do, because they had been fighting storms since the day they were born. Deep space monitoring stations continued to track the remnants of the Vraxith swarm in the months that followed, and the analysts noticed something remarkable and unprecedented in the swarm's behavior. The Vraxith avoided any system that broadcast human transponder codes. The predators of the galaxy had learned that there was a species they could not harvest, and the lesson had been taught in fire and blood, and the lesson had stuck. And the Vraxith were many things, but they were not stupid, and they knew the taste of a predator more dangerous than themselves. A concordance historian named Thuvalis spent 6 months writing the definitive assessment of humanity's intervention, and the document ran to 300 pages, and it was meticulous and thorough, and it examined every aspect of the crisis, from the initial SOS to the founding of the Compact, and it would be studied and debated for centuries. The final line of the document was the one that everyone remembered. We called them monsters, and we called them Deathworlders, and we were right, because they are exactly as dangerous as we feared. But what we failed to understand is that they are dangerous on behalf of everyone who cannot be dangerous for themselves. Far away from Lorathis Prime, and far away from Earth, and far away from the Concordance and the Compact, and all the politics, and all the history that was being made, a small freighter, crewed by a species that humanity had never encountered, suffered a catastrophic engine failure in deep space. The ship was called the Kindness of Currents, and it carried a crew of 12, and they were aquatic beings who had only recently developed faster-than-light travel, and this was one of their first voyages beyond their home system, and the engine failure was total, and life support was failing, and the captain did not know what to do, because there was no one nearby, and no one who would hear, and no one who would come. But the captain had heard the stories, because everyone in the galaxy had heard the stories by now. And so the captain activated the emergency broadcast, and sent an SOS on all frequencies, and then sat back and waited, and tried not to hope too hard. Within 7 minutes, a human patrol vessel called the UEN Steadfast responded, and the voice on the other end of the comm was calm and professional, and it said that help was on the way, and that they should hold on. On the bridge of the Kindness of Currents, the captain wept with relief, because the stories were true. The humans answered. They always answered.